Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. We spoke last year and we had 5 people in the audience, so I feel like this is a massive step up for us. Even though there's a few empty seats, I guess it's 9 a.m. I'm Paul Seymour. I'm co-CEO and co-founder of a consultancy, software development consultancy called Patient Zero. So we have about 70 odd people. Primarily, we work in government and enterprise, and we do a lot of rescue projects or kind of app modernisation type projects. And our industry's been changing a lot over the last year, and particularly over the last 6 months. I was going to be presenting with Demelza, who's another co-CEO in the company. She unfortunately had to go home to New Zealand for a family emergency on the weekend. So Bay has very kindly agreed to step in.
Yep, last minute. I'm Bay, I'm a principal at Patient Zero, so thanks for having me. Demelza is small, but she has big shoes to fill, so hopefully I can be the B side to Demelza's A side. So we're going to hit you with some quick numbers first. So apparently 79% of app modernisation projects fail. Not good numbers there. In 2025, 22.7 billion spent on app modernisation. So if we take those figures, we can maybe assume that $18 billion was wasted in 2025 alone on app modernisation.
And what we've tended to see is a lot of app modernisation fails, but they redefine the success criteria to make it pass anyway. And so it never really gets reported as a failed project. Right, so what would you be thinking out of this? You would be thinking, up to this point, the process of modernising apps is fraught with danger. Very few of those projects tend to succeed. And mostly, if you're an old mainframe app, you'd be pretty safe thinking you're going to be around for a while.
Yeah.
But there's been some really big changes in our industry, probably over the last couple of years, but particularly in the last 6 months or so. Towards the end of last year, there was a bunch of Anthropic models released, particularly the Claude ones, that really revolutionised the process of modernising old systems.
So I don't know if any of you have worked on any of these legacy apps. I worked at Queensland Health many years ago. There's a system called Hibiscus. Imagine getting rid of that, this old green screen system. They're shrouded in an air of mystery. The developers who work in these old languages, they know things that no one else could possibly know, and as a product owner in that space, it's even more shrouded. You're not getting access to that information. But maybe that's changing?
Well, the developers aren't going to change. So I guess one thing about developers, particularly developers that are familiar with old systems, is they really have a vested interest in continuing those old systems a lot of the time.
Protecting their jobs.
Yeah, and so, even though they can sort of be on board with the project, they tend to hold a lot of knowledge, and it is quite difficult to get that out of them. So the sorts of languages we see around in these old systems, Fortran, RPG, COBOL, the skill set of the people that understand those systems and the age of those people, we do a bit of work for a Queensland department that flies COBOL developers over from the UK. And I think the average age was like 70 or 75. So those people aren't going to be around forever. This is a little green screen app written in COBOL. So we were trying to figure out about 3 months ago whether or not a lot of these new AI systems would actually work well with these legacy languages. So we kind of went the other way and we thought, well, we didn't actually have a system to modernise at that point. So what we would do is write something and this is written in COBOL, and it took about 2.5 hours with a bunch of agents to generate, it's a flight tracker. We were actually stuck in the airport with a late running plane, so we thought, well, maybe we can track where the planes are coming from.
Yeah. And you can tell the folks where to find the app, not sponsored, not making any money.
It is actually live. It's at greensky.electricsheep.au if you
really want this sort of interface for tracking your flights. I mean, don't we all? So today we're going to tell you 3 stories of AI transformations in regulated industries, the challenges that they were facing in those transformations and what they ended up doing to get through there. So the first story is about an RPG IBM mainframe system in a bank, 20 years or so, just tentacles everywhere throughout all their other platforms.
Yeah, so we didn't actually do this one. It is a person that's associated with us. over in WA, it was the regional bank that was tied into a larger bank. They had wanted to split off their kind of banking systems from the old mainframe that was running. They'd been looking at the project, I think, for many, many years. They'd never really commercially been able to build the case to do it. There was virtually no product documentation, really old tech.
And developers don't read it anyway, right, Paul?
So they had an original estimate to do this, which was 15 mil, 18 months, and they kind of estimated they'd need 3 teams of 5 devs in there. My reading on this would be pretty much all of these run over budget and over time. So I would be skeptical that they would actually get it done for that. They ended up doing this over about 3 months. So one guy kind of spearheaded it in there. Eventually they built a team around him, but it cost about $500,000 in labour and about $300,000 in tokens, and they rebuilt the core banking system inside this regional bank. So it was quite an extraordinary outcome.
Yeah. So story number 2, we're going to tell you in 2 parts. It's an app end of life story, and obviously apps have a shorter life cycle than these legacy systems, so it will come up a lot more frequently.
Right, so this is an ASX listed company that we work with. The CIO called towards the middle of last year, and they had a big deal closing in which they needed to provide a couple of apps. They thought that they had the apps that they needed, and when they tried to deploy them into the App Store, they hit this restriction around very old tech, a language called Xamarin, and the app stores wouldn't accept them anymore. So they were 2 weeks out from closing this deal. If they did not ship these apps, the deal was going to fall through. And so they reached out and said, can you actually rewrite these things in that sort of time frame? So, and they were not small apps. They had about 40 pages each.
Yeah. So part 1, we're going back about 9 months. We had the remit 2 weeks. We had to get something into the App Store. So it was a minimum set of native React screens with links out. We got that done in 2 weeks and deployed. And then we spent the next 12 weeks building out all the other native screens. And we used augmented AI to deliver these, which we'll talk a little bit about later.
Yeah, so there's a few different modes of AI development, but augmented AI development was probably the dominant one about 9 months ago, though that has recently changed.
So we fast forward to only about 3 months ago. We had a much more aggressive timeline. So we gave ourselves 8 weeks, we had 6 apps, and we sold the story that we could get this done. So what we did is we built the 6 apps as an MVP iteration in the first 2 weeks, built out all the screens, all the core functionality. Then we spent 4 more weeks polishing the apps, UI, fixes, bugs, all those sorts of things. And at the end of those 6 weeks, we handed over the apps to the client for testing, and that was the end of that, which left us with 2 weeks. So in those 2 weeks, we decided to build a proof of concept for them. They had a Sitecore CMS that they needed to not only migrate from on-prem to cloud, but obviously Sitecore has a lot of licensing fees and those sorts of things with it. So we built them a proof of concept that would have a strapless CMS, a headless CMS, I should say, called Strappy. And we built an interface with Slack to allow them to say, hey, we need to spin up a new site here, the brand colors from reference URL, and off you go and do it. So we packaged that up and sent them to them in 2 weeks to give them an idea of what would be possible for them in the future.
And these were not trivial apps. One of those apps was for ANZ, so they're fairly high volume.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about a few different modes of AI development. So AI augmentation is kind of the thing that people are most used to. You're kind of like a co-pilot type environment. You sort of got a chat, you're talking to some sort of AI and it's helping you write code or understand code. That was probably the dominant way of doing things up until maybe 9 months ago.
Yeah, and that was part 1. We were working in that mode.
Yeah. So AI agents was kind of the next transition, and that was where a developer, or generally it was a developer, it might be an orchestrator at that point, would be talking to an AI and operating at a slightly higher level and saying, hey, I need you to build this particular piece of functionality, this feature. I need you to document this thing for me, right? Where it's sort of moved to in the last 6 months is fully autonomous agentic systems. So these systems do all of the documentation, a lot of the requirements gathering, a lot of the testing. They build out the pipelines, they deploy the applications, and they write the code. And they do it at a scale that is really hard to wrap your head around sometimes. We will have projects where there will be literally hundreds of agents spin up for, maybe only an hour or two, but the volume of work that gets done, I think our industry is in a lot of danger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So story number 3, those dreaded 3 letters, SAP, people love to hate.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we work for a utilities company, government regulated. We've been working with them for a couple of years, and originally we were in there kind of helping their development teams, but AI has obviously come into the mix over the last year or so. They have SAP through all of their systems, through HR, finance, payroll, asset management.
It's a pretty common story in a lot of big companies.
Yeah, and they're looking to innovate, and they're looking to try and take, various bits of this functionality back in-house. Cost them a lot of money. Once they told me that they were spending, it was like $75,000 to get a field added to a form in SAP, and it was like 3 months or something. So they're trying to figure out how they can take control of bits of this platform back. Yeah. So there's a pretty common pattern prior to AI called Strangler Fig, and the idea is when you've got these big systems, they can be legacy systems or they can just be, platforms that are very tightly coupled into your business. Strangler Fig is this pattern of kind of taking core bits or bits around the edges rather, and slowly chunking that out and shrinking the footprint of the core system by replacing it with, bits of rewritten software. Generally, it failed a lot of the time because what would happen is parts of those edges would be migrated over into a new system, but then budgets would run out, timeframes would blow out, and they would stop there. And so what you'd wind up with is a mix of technologies. So you'd have the core system, you'd have, somebody's idea of what the new version of the system should be, but it never actually completed.
Yeah. So what we're looking at in the future is maybe a SaaS apocalypse. So if the constraints of time and money maybe get taken away and we can iterate a lot faster, does it mean that a lot of these SaaS platforms are obsolete? Oh, it's a bit of a buzzword in the industry at the moment, but what we're trying to say is that you can chip away faster, you can take those tentacles back from where they've been incrementally, but quickly as well.
Yeah, so that particular company is now actually, or utility is now, has a plan to shrink SAP back to just their finance and payroll.
Yeah.
And replace. And to me, that was unheard of. Like, nobody ever really managed to do that before.
How do you unravel all that?
This is also hitting a lot of product companies. So if you see the share prices of, Atlassian, Xero, so there's a theory that it may or may not be true that a lot of organizations are going to start writing their own versions of these systems and replace products. And certainly in at Patient Zero, we've been looking at things like our CRM and a few other platforms that we subscribe to, and we've been writing versions of them. DocuSign, we've written a version of that we run ourselves now. So it's an interesting world.
Yeah, and it really turns the whole build versus buy question on its head. Back in the day, the proposition was, hey, we've got all this functionality, you don't have to do anything, which we all know is a little bit of a lie because everyone thinks that their business is different and special and you end up customizing some stuff. But in any case, they're providing a suite. At this point in time, maybe that suite is not necessary and you're sort of buying into something that could end up being tech debt for the company, because when you feel like you need to adapt or change, you can't roll out of that place you've put yourself into. So we've talked a little bit about the tech, or a lot of bit about the tech maybe, but what really is core to all these changes are the people. So, AI is out to take our jobs, but actually we do need people to help make a lot of these changes going forward. And when we're looking at who those people are, we've sort of found out that it's not a training issue that's holding us back from being successful in these changes.
So it's a very interesting lady. We heard her speak at CES at the start of the year. So she was an executive, I think, in GlaxoSmithKline. She's on the board of a bunch of big American companies. And she was talking about the process that they've been going through in those companies over the last couple of years, trying to push AI adoption into these big, I think that most of them were like, S&P listed companies, right? So they're big companies. And she said project after project just failed. And they always thought it was a training issue. So they kept going back to, the tooling, getting specialists in to help people understand and adopt tooling. And it just never went anywhere. She said eventually they got to the point where they realized that it wasn't a training issue at all. It was a cultural issue. And figuring out how to actually get people to adopt and interact with these systems is a big challenge. In the US at the moment, I think 90% of Americans believe AI is bad. It's going to take their job, and they have a negative view of it. And that has changed since last year. 12 months ago, I think a similar survey, they had around 90% of Americans had a positive sense around AI. This is a chart that Anthropic released. The blue area is kind of the potential or the current capability of AI in those various industries. And the red is the extent to which it's being actually utilised at the moment. So you see areas like computer and math, so that's going to be software development, engineering. They kind of are out in front a bit. I guess what I'd take from this graph is that the sort of things that we're going through as a consultancy, trying to figure out, how to adopt this, a lot of industries are going to be on that pathway probably in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah. The perception is that it's just software, but it's actually not quite that.
Yeah. So here's a Gartner graph that kind of says the same thing. If you look at software engineering, it's essentially saying most software engineering teams that are using AI are kind of down that augmented end. So they're kind of playing around with Copilot. The leading companies are up, right up around the top Agentic end. But the gap is, they reckon, over 75% of software development that is actually using AI, and that's probably only a small percentage of the total pool. Over 75% of people need retraining or...
Yeah, if that works.
Yeah, if you can actually retrain.
So then it comes down to what are we looking for? So what sort of people are going to be involved with creating this kind of change in organisation? So if we go back to the 75-year-old COBOL developer, their risk tolerance is low. They're used to making small incremental changes to systems and having to keep it stable because it's been there for 20 years. We can't have that thing falling apart or breaking down. And their biggest fear is that system wouldn't be there for them to have a job in anymore, or that technology becomes obsolete. When we're looking at someone who might be an AI orchestrator, they have to be very comfortable with ambiguity, change. Their risk tolerance has to be a lot higher. And they understand that part of their job is that if they don't keep adapting and moving forward, they will fall behind and themselves become obsolete. So it's just a completely different shift in terms of how you're thinking about the people we're working with. So Gartner has some information that they predict that by 2030, CIOs are going to have to, based on those traits that we're looking at, completely rethink how they structure their IT systems. And we're not, departments I should say, and we're not talking about like small incremental change. We're talking about org structure changes. So from top to bottom, it could look completely different. The roles within those structures will be completely different, and even how people are remunerated could be different as well. Maybe it's an outcomes-based model, maybe it's something else, but 2030 isn't that far away, and a lot of people, their identity is tied up in the work they do. So that change, it's scary, and that's understandable.
Yeah, so we, that project that we did a few months ago where we were using entirely agentic AI, we went out to the company. So it's a company of 70 people. I know it's not that large, but out of that entire company, we had 3 people volunteer to go on that project. And our company's predominantly software engineers and designers and product owners.
Yeah.
And I guess that corresponds to what everybody's telling us at the moment, that organizations are really struggling to adopt particularly a lot of the agentic models.
Yeah, and so that brings you down to who who are you going to pick for these roles? You know, you might have the best software developer, but are they the person who is going to achieve that outcome for you? So you're choosing the people for these roles that will achieve those outcomes for you. So we're almost at time, but Paul is going to quickly talk through some predictions. We can argue with him about them later too if we want, so feel free to come up and tell Paul he's wrong.
Well, I don't think this is a prediction.
No,
so
this is probably not wrong.
One of the things we're seeing at the moment is massive overinvestment in, well, I consider it to be overinvestment. So you have OpenAI raised like 200 billion US in data center build out on like 20 billion, 30 billion revenue. So like everybody knows that's not sustainable. That means, you know, what we're currently paying for AI and tokens cost, it's got to go up by maybe an order of magnitude, which I think is not going to be sustainable ultimately for the industry. We're also seeing the convergence of models. So, you know, Anthropic would release a model and then literally a week, a month, sometimes hours later, there would be the Google version or there would be the OpenAI version. And the gap between those models keeps narrowing. So they're kind of putting each other out of business to some extent. And China is releasing the open weight models. I'll talk a little bit about those in a sec. And they are growing in capability at a very rapid rate. And they're a fraction of the cost to run, especially if you consider what the frontier models are ultimately going to cost to be able to be profitable. This guy, Scott Galloway, I won't read that out, but he's basically saying that he thinks the strategy at the moment with China is to create really capable, high-value open weight models that anybody can run. Like you can run these things locally, you can run them in your own data centers, solve a lot of problems around cost and sovereignty, and particularly if you're talking about agentic systems where you can burn, you know, millions of tokens very, very quickly.
Yeah.
I guess one of the scare things, or the scare campaigns around the Chinese open weight models is that somehow they're security compromised. They're not. It makes about as much sense as saying that a book you're reading is spying on you, right? An open weight model is as secure as the environment that you run it in. So it's certainly possible to run these things securely in your own environment.
All right, so what's the wrap up on all of this? What are our key takeaways? We have 4. So the first one, time and cost, they should no longer be the limiting factors on starting to look at replacing those legacy systems.
Yeah, you want to look at Strangler patterns. So what you really want to do is use agentic AI to build around the edges of these systems and continue that process till you completely modernize them.
Yeah, and when the people you need to do that are the ones who can achieve those outcomes for you. They have the willingness, the mindset, and the lack of fear of doing things a different way. And
when you're looking at cost and sovereignty issues, really consider the open weight models because they are coming up in capability and to me they make a lot of sense. I ultimately think they'll probably win out, you know, I guess in the same way that open source systems and Linux kind of beat the proprietary operating systems. I suspect a similar thing will happen.
The end.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening.